Welcome back to Cyberspace, the podcast that helps you understand your world. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Today, we're taking an unbiased look into a very poignant topic: the complex psychological reactions that emerge from high-profile acts of violence. We're using the recent incident involving the CEO of a major healthcare company as a lens with which to explore broader societal reactions. This isn't just a discussion about the event itself, but an exploration of the deeper currents that drive our collective responses. What strikes me about this particular situation is the way reactions to it revealed the delicate balance between some of our more harmful but normalized systems and us, the people these systems impact, crossing political, ideological, and geographical divides. When major events like this occur, they trigger what we call priming, essentially preparing our minds to react in certain ways based on our previous experiences and beliefs. This psychological phenomenon shapes how we interpret and respond to events from the very first moment that we hear about them. Think about how quickly information spreads in our modern world. Within moments of an incident, our minds are already processing, categorizing, and forming responses. But here's what's particularly interesting. Research shows that these initial reactions often have less to do with the actual event and more to do with our pre-existing psychological framework. It's like our brains have already written part of the story before we even get all the details. The research in this area reveals something fascinating about human nature. When we encounter high-profile incidents of violence, our brains immediately start working on multiple levels. There's the immediate emotional response, perhaps one or more emotions such as shock, fear, anger, excitement, or even glee in some cases. But underneath that, there's a complex process of meaning-making happening. We're not just reacting to the event itself, we're processing it through layers of our personal experiences, social context, and collective memory. What makes this topic particularly relevant is how these psychological reactions ripple through society. They don't just stay in our individual minds. They spread through communities, influence policy decisions, and shape public discourse. Understanding these patterns isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential for making sense of how societies process and respond to traumatic events. As we unpack these reactions today, we'll look at how different psychological theories help us understand not just what people do in response to high-profile violence, but why they do it. We'll examine how individual reactions become collective responses, and how these responses can either heal or further divide communities. So, let's dig in. Why do people react so differently to the same event? What can this teach us about society, authority, and ourselves? When tragedy strikes, it's almost instinctual for people and societies to look for someone to blame. This isn't just about seeking justice or finding the perpetrator. It's about understanding the deeper social and psychological processes at play. It's also about managing our own feelings of fear and uncertainty. Scapegoating serves as a complex defense mechanism, a way to discharge pent-up aggression by projecting it onto others. Historically, this has been seen in times of social turmoil, where leaders or distinct groups become the face of broader issues. In the case of the CEO shooting, the immediate assignment of blame reveals not just individual feelings, but a collective psyche grappling with loss and injustice. These reactions are often amplified by the person's role in society. Leaders, due to their visibility and decision-making power, naturally attract more intense scrutiny and emotion. The research on scapegoating reveals something profound about human nature. Studies show that this isn't just a modern phenomenon. It's deeply rooted in how humans process threats and uncertainty. When we face complex problems that feel overwhelming, our brains naturally look for simpler explanations and clear targets for our emotions. What's particularly fascinating is how this process works in the age of social media and instant communication. Research on digital network images and public shaming shows us that modern technology has created new pathways for collective blame and moral outrage. These platforms can amplify our natural tendency to seek out scapegoats, creating what researchers call digital vigilantism, where public shaming and blame attribution happen at unprecedented speeds and scales. But here's where it gets really interesting. The psychology of authority adds another layer to this dynamic. Studies on leadership and crisis show that how we view authority figures fundamentally shapes our response to tragic events. When something goes wrong, we often focus our attention on leaders, not just because of their actual role in events, but because they represent the systems we feel have failed us. The concept of moral disengagement, developed by Bandura, helps us understand why some people might support extreme actions against authority figures during times of crisis. It's not that people suddenly become irrational. Instead, there's a gradual process where normal moral restraints are suspended because traditional channels for addressing grievances have been proven ineffective. Social identity theory adds another necessary piece to this puzzle. Research shows that during crises, people often strengthen their group identities, creating stronger distinctions between us and them. This can lead to what researchers call intergroup schadenfreude, taking pleasures in the misfortunes of those perceived as being in an opposing group, particularly when those others are seen as having power or privilege. The psychology of collective efficacy also plays a vital role here. When communities feel powerless against large systems or institutions, they often focus their frustration on visible representatives of those systems. This isn't just about individual psychology, it's about how groups process and respond to perceived threats to their well-being. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "A riot is the language of the unheard," and we can extrapolate from that in society that violence is often the language of the unheard. Psychologists have emphasized the human need for being understood and valued. We have long studied how suppressed grievances and a lack of effective communication channels can lead to aggressive expressions. When people feel that peaceful means have failed to bring about change, some may turn to violence as a last resort, a desperate form of communication, signaling deep-seated frustrations with failed systems. When we talk about violence as communication, we must understand that it's often the end result of a long process of frustration and many failed attempts at other forms of expression. The frustration-aggression hypothesis helps us understand this progression. What's particularly fascinating is how this connects to fundamental human needs. The research tells us that humans have a deep-seated need to be heard and understood, and when conventional channels of communication break down, when people feel their voices are consistently ignored, something interesting happens in the human psyche. We see this pattern repeated throughout history and across different societies. Research on institutional ineffectiveness shows us that when traditional channels for addressing grievances fail, people don't just give up. They often seek alternative means of expression. Discussing this instance this week isn't about justifying violence. It's about understanding the psychological journey that leads to these breaking points. The psychology of moral disengagement plays a role here as well. Studies show that people don't typically jump straight to supporting or engaging in violent acts. Instead, there's a gradual process where normal moral restraints are suspended. This happens through what researchers call moral justification, where actions that would normally be considered unacceptable become viewed as necessary or even righteous. What's particularly interesting is how collective experiences shape these responses. Research on group dynamics shows us that when large numbers of people share similar experiences of frustration and powerlessness, their individual psychological responses can amplify each other. This creates what some researchers call a collective action potential, where shared grievances become the catalyst for more dramatic forms of expression. Modern research on cognitive processing and extreme political action reveals something fascinating about this progression. It's not just about emotion overriding reason. Studies show that people often engage in complex moral reasoning to justify their support for or engagement in violent acts. They're not abandoning rationality. They're operating under a different moral framework that emerges from their experiences of systemic failure. Let's talk about the role media plays in shaping our understanding of events like these. What we're seeing isn't just simple reporting, it's a complex interplay of narrative formation and psychological processing. The media's portrayal of the CEO shooting, for example, varies significantly across different media outlets, each painting a different picture of the victim and the perpetrator, thus influencing public sentiment in diverse ways, including how the public processes emotions and assigns blame. Think about how information reaches us today. Within moments of an event, multiple narratives start emerging, each shaped by different perspectives and agendas. What's fascinating from a psychological standpoint is how our brains process these competing narratives. Research on cognitive dissonance shows us that when we encounter conflicting information, our minds don't simply absorb everything equally. Instead, we engage in what psychologists call selective perception. Studies show that we tend to gravitate towards information that confirms our existing beliefs. That's our old friend from previous episodes, confirmation bias at work. But here's what's particularly interesting. This isn't just about being stubborn or closed-minded. It's our brain's way of maintaining psychological stability in the face of overwhelming information. The research on emotional contagion in media coverage reveals something remarkable about how emotions spread through society. Just like a virus can move through a population, emotions can cascade through social networks and media channels. When we see intense emotional reactions in media coverage, our mirror neurons, these fascinating brain cells that help us empathize with others, start firing, making us more likely to experience similar emotional responses. Modern algorithmically driven social media adds another layer to this complexity. Studies on digital networked images and public shaming show us that social media platforms don't just transmit information, they amplify emotional responses and can create what researchers call emotional echo chambers. These are spaces where certain emotional reactions and interpretations get reinforced while opposing viewpoints get filtered out. What's particularly interesting is how different media outlets frame the same events in vastly different ways. This isn't just about bias. It's about tapping into what psychologists call narrative templates that resonate with their audience's existing beliefs and values. Research shows that these frames don't just influence what we think about events, they actually can shape how we emotionally process and remember them. The impact of this media framing goes beyond individual perception. Studies on collective memory formation show that media narratives play a crucial role in how societies as a whole remember and make sense of significant events. These shared narratives become part of what researchers call our collective consciousness, influencing how we respond to similar situations in the future. Let's get into something that's at the heart of the recent CEO assassination event: the psychological impact of systemic healthcare system failures, in particular, the perceived failure of the health insurance industry to serve its customers' best interest instead of serving shareholder interests. This isn't just about individual frustrations. We're looking at what psychologists call learned helplessness on a massive scale. The research here tells us something profound about how repeated negative experiences shape our psychological responses. When people consistently encounter barriers to healthcare access, when they face denial after denial of necessary care, something fundamental changes in their psychological makeup. Studies show that this isn't just about feeling frustrated. It's about a deep-seated change in how people view their ability to influence their own health outcomes. What makes this particularly compelling from a psychological perspective is how these individual experiences compound into collective trauma. Research on group psychology shows us that when enough people share similar negative experiences, it creates what we might call a collective learned helplessness. This shared experience of powerlessness can fundamentally alter how entire communities view and interact with healthcare systems. And here's where it gets really interesting. research on catastrophe compassion shows us something remarkable about human nature. In times of crisis, when systems are clearly failing, people often respond not with panic or cruelty, but with increased cooperation and care for others who are suffering similarly. This phenomenon has been documented across various cultures and contexts. The psychological impact of systemic healthcare failures goes beyond the individual's stress or anxiety. Studies on institutional trust show us that when healthcare systems repeatedly fail to meet basic needs, it creates what researchers call a crisis of legitimacy. This isn't just about being unhappy with a service. It's about a fundamental breach in the social contract between institutions and the people they're meant to serve. What's particularly concerning is how these systemic failures interact with existing psychological vulnerabilities. Research shows that when people are already dealing with health challenges, the additional stress of fighting with healthcare systems can create what psychologists call a compound effect, where the psychological burden of seeking care actually exacerbates the health conditions people are trying to address. When we look at how leaders respond in crisis situations, we're watching something compelling from a psychological perspective. Under intense pressure, we often see reactions that reveal deep truths about human behavior and decision-making processes. Research on leadership psychology shows us that crisis responses often follow predictable patterns. When leaders feel threatened, they sometimes resort to what psychologists call defensive attribution, essentially trying to distance themselves from the responsibility while simultaneously attempting to maintain control of the narrative. What's particularly interesting is how stress affects decision-making at the highest levels. Studies on cognitive processing under pressure reveal that even experienced leaders can fall into what's called threat rigidity response, becoming more rigid and controlling in their approach precisely when flexibility and openness might be more beneficial. The psychological concept of mirror neurons helps explain why leaders' responses can have such a profound impact on public sentiment. These neural mechanisms mean that when leaders display genuine empathy and understanding, it can help calm public anxiety. Conversely, when leaders appear defensive or disconnected, it can amplify public distrust and frustration. Recent research on organizational behavior during crises shows us something fascinating about institutional responses. When organizations face public backlash, there's often a tendency toward what researchers call institutional defensiveness, a pattern of responses aimed at protecting the organization's image rather than addressing underlying issues. After the recent incident in which the healthcare CEO was killed, the arrest of a woman for her honest, verbal, private, justifiably emotional reaction to denied healthcare claims was not only a violation of her right to free speech, most likely, but potentially an attempt by authorities to control the narrative and prevent unrest. The arrest of individuals for emotional reactions to real injuries, moral or physical, represents what psychologists call system justification in action, where authorities attempt to maintain existing power structures by suppressing challenges to the system. Research shows that such responses often backfire because they fail to account for what's called emotional resonance, the way personal stories and reactions can echo and amplify throughout a community. One of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology is how crisis situations can actually strengthen our social bonds. What we're seeing in response to recent events isn't just random grouping. It's a manifestation of what social psychologists call collective identity formation. Research on catastrophe compassion shows us something remarkable about human nature. Studies consistently find that, contrary to popular belief about people panicking during crises, we often see increased cooperation and mutual support. This isn't just feel-good behavior. It's actually a sophisticated psychological adaptation that helps communities survive and recover from trauma. What's particularly interesting is how social identity theory helps us understand this process. When people face common challenges or threats, psychological barriers between different social groups often become more permeable. We're seeing this play out in real time as people from various backgrounds share their healthcare struggles, creating what researchers call a superordinate identity, a shared sense of being in the same boat. The psychological concept of emotional contagion takes on a positive dimension here. Just as negative emotions can spread through a population, research shows that compassion and solidarity can also be contagious. When people witness others showing support and taking action, it activates neural pathways associated with empathy and prosocial behavior. Studies on collective efficacy reveal something powerful about group psychology during crises. When people come together around a shared grievance, it creates what researchers call collective consciousness, a shared understanding of the situation that can lead to coordinated collective action. This isn't just about emotional support. It's about transforming individual helplessness into collective agency. What makes this particularly fascinating is how modern communication technologies influence these solidarity networks. Research on digital social networks shows that online platforms can amplify these connections, creating what some researchers call digital solidarity communities, spaces where people can share experiences, offer support, and organize for change across traditional geographic and social boundaries. Recent studies on prosocial behavior during crises have revealed something profound about human nature. When the systems fail, people will often step up to fill the gaps, creating informal community support networks that can be remarkably effective. This isn't just random acts of kindness, it's a sophisticated form of collective problem solving that emerges from shared experiences of systemic failure. Let's talk about a fascinating approach borrowed from medical practice that has profound implications for how we could potentially handle systemic failures. We'll focus on systemic issues within the healthcare insurance industry, in keeping with current events. The morbidity and mortality review process isn't just about finding what went wrong. It's about understanding the complex interplay of factors that lead insurance companies to make decisions that harm patients. Research in industrial organizational psychology shows us that this systematic approach to reviewing failures can be incredibly powerful when applied to systems, such as insurance practices and policies. It's not about protecting the system. It's about understanding what psychologists call the error chain, the sequence of decisions, automated processes, and institutional practices that led to devastating claim denials and patient outcomes. What makes this approach particularly valuable for potentially reforming healthcare insurance practices is how it aligns with what we know about effective institutional change. Studies on organizational learning show that when we create what psychologists call psychological safety, an environment where honest examination of harmful policies becomes possible, companies are much more likely to identify and address the root causes of their systemic failures rather than just defending their practices. The research on systemic review processes reveals something critical about institutional change. When companies like healthcare insurance companies approach problems with a structured methodology focused on patient outcomes, they're more likely to engage in what researchers call productive reflection, the kind of deep thinking that leads to meaningful policy changes and better healthcare access, as opposed to the negative impact of the current monetary high-profit focus. Recent studies in cognitive psychology have shown us that this kind of systematic review process can help overcome what's called institutional inertia, the tendency of companies to defend and maintain harmful practices simply because they're established. By carefully examining each step in the chain of denied claims and their impact on human lives, insurance companies could better understand how to prevent devastating outcomes and potentially rebuild trust with the communities they serve. As we look towards solutions, psychological research offers us some powerful insights about how meaningful change happens. Studies on resilience theory show us that systems, whether they're individual humans or entire societies, have a remarkable capacity for adaptation and growth, even after significant disruption. What's particularly interesting is how psychological research on collective action maps onto successful systemic change. We know from studies that when people develop what's called collective efficacy, a shared belief in their ability to affect change, they're more likely to engage in sustained efforts towards reform. Recent research on social movements has revealed something fascinating about how change actually happens. It's not just about addressing surface-level problems. It's about what psychologists call transformative learning, the kind of deep change that reshapes how entire systems operate. Studies on successful societal transformations show us that lasting change requires attention to both structural and psychological factors. It's not enough to just change policies or procedures. We actually need to address what researchers call the psychological infrastructure of systems, the beliefs, values, and assumptions that guide how people interact with those systems. The research on adaptive systems tells us something critical about creating lasting change. It needs to create what psychologists call psychological ownership. This is where people feel they have a genuine stake in the new system, leading to what researchers term sustainable engagement, the kind of long-term commitment needed for real transformation. Today, we've taken a deep dive into the psychological currents that underlie public reaction to both systemic crisis and vigilante violence. By understanding these deep-seated responses, we can better navigate systemic challenges and work towards a more empathetic, cohesive, supportive, and proactive society. Thank you for joining me for this sometimes delicate topic. Remember, understanding the depths of human psychology is not just about academic interest. It's about effecting real change in the world. A bit of housekeeping before we close out. The research for this episode will be in the show notes. I'd love to hear your feedback. You can always email me at the email in the RSS feed of the show, or join me on our brand new Patreon, where you can leave comments about past episodes, this episode's, or drop your ideas for future episodes. Our Patreon is free, and it's linked to on our website at cyber.space. Thank you for tuning in to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. Until next time, keep looking for ways to help create systems that support everyone in society, and remember, stay curious.